So our speaker, Dr. Patrick Jacques, provides psychotherapy and assessment services to adults at Gilmour Psychological Services in Ottawa. He journeys alongside individuals in their desire to experience emotional health, create life change, and rediscover a hope-filled vision for their lives. Dr. Jacques' primary therapeutic approach integrates cognitive, behavioral, emotion-focused, and psychodynamic theories. Dr. Jacques works to provide a collective, safe, and warm therapeutic relationship, keeping the client's goals at the forefront of the treatment plan. Dr. Jacques is a member of the College of Psychologists in Ontario and the Canadian Psychology Association. Okay, there's so much more to what our guest does. So I'll let you, Dr. Patrick Jacques, to introduce yourself again, if you'd like, and go ahead with the presentation for today.
Thanks, Dobie, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever persons are watching at this time. And I'm just so grateful for the kind invitation. I'm just proud of Culture Check and all the things that this organization has been doing. It's much needed now more than ever to create safe spaces for cultural awareness, as well as this platform here where we can exchange ideas and experiences. So to all those that are taking time off out of your day to be here, I'm truly grateful to spend this time with you. I'm kind of in between clients, and I'm glad this is a nice kind of change of pace. I don't do these presentations too often. Me and the founder of Culture Check, Nathan Hall, go back a long way, childhood buddies, and I'm grateful that we could reconnect. And I'm grateful for his invite and for Dobie Joki, all the great work you've done behind the scenes. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Patrick Jacques. I just graduated this past year with a clinical psychology degree from Fuller Theological Seminary in California. And I'm now in the nation's capital myself. I grew up out in Orleans, and it's nice to be back here. My first time back living in the area in over 22 years. Growing up here, when I left the university, I would have never imagined that I would be residing in Ottawa, let alone be working in a group practice in downtown Ottawa. Life has an interesting way of cycling you back to certain places, hopefully a newer, more improved version of yourself. And I'm honored to be able to give back to the city that has given so much to me. So a lot of my studies anchored around resilience. I did some focus studies on Caribbean psychology. I'm of Haitian Canadian descent. And I also did some studies on Caribbean theology and the intersection between those. And those are some wonderful conversations, how slavery and indoctrination, the history of colonization, how that continues to shape modern psyche of Caribbean Canadians or persons from the African diaspora. So a lot of the studies that have been around have been studies around racialized minorities and some wonderful emerging theories. So I say all that to say, my focus today is going to be on minority stress, one of the many incredible theories that I came across over my time in my studies and presently. And I'm going to kind of share just a very brief presentation. We're going to use a bulk of our second half for any questions that may arise from the chat. And I know that'll be facilitated well. And I really want to hear from you. I really want to hear what kind of concerns and ideas emerge from it. It's a 2-page worksheet that I know will be distributed to those that may want a copy of it. I like to keep jargony, confusing psychological jargon to a very minimum and to teach it as simple as possible. Now, why are theories important? Theories are important because theories remind you that your lived-in experience is not unique, but others are going through it. So I'm going to kind of share with you why theories are important, why this theory is important to me. But the message that I really want you to leave with today, everyone, is that there's hope if you've experienced minority stress. So I'm going to just share screen now, and we're going to talk about it together a little bit in our time. Let's open this screen up a little bit. Make this a little bigger. So I'm working from a PDF, which I just thought just seeing it all on one page would be a lot easier, as opposed to kind of going through a PowerPoint. All right, here we are. All right, so we're talking today about minority stress. It's one of many emerging theories. What's cool about the theory, it hasn't been around that long. It's been around for about 20 years. The term minority stress was coined back in the 90s. However, a model like this one that you're seeing, which is really a summary of what we're going to talk about today, really emerged in 2003 by Dr. Mayer and some associates. So the minority stress theory, MST, is going to be referred to in this presentation. Essentially, it's really a conversation around what transpires just generally in the life of those that are racialized minorities. As you'll see here, based on the model, what happens is that there's circumstances that arise, and those circumstances affect certain types of people. We could use disadvantaged population, marginalized population, minority populations, but the focus is on racialized minorities. This was a model originally created to address the experiences of sexual minorities, whether identity or orientation. And what's good about these models is that if it's a good, meaty foundation, it can then be expanded. So I've expanded it. There's not a lot of research in its application to racialized minorities, believe it or not. And that's certainly when I have time again to get back into research and writing, I'd love to build on this model. So many of the comments and your reflections today might be included in those future kind of reflections. So you'll see here, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, which is going to be our focus right here. And then gender, and those are considered what you would call minority identities. We're going to start first macro, just in society in general, and then we're going to go macro to the workplace environment. And then you have two types of stressors that can occur as you live in your community, in your society. Those can be called general stressors, which affect everybody. And then you have what you call minority-specific, unique stressors that impact specifically racialized minorities, and some racialized minority groups more than others. And it talks about how, what might be some of the effects. The word here is processes, but I think to make it a little bit more clear, it's more so how we then respond to some of those events that take place that are minority stressors that speak to minority stress theory. So these are prejudicial, discriminatory events, microaggressions, stigmatized comments and encounters. And as a result of that, what this model has kind of begun to extrapolate is it's kind of good family, because we talk about a lot of symptoms, everyone, about how we respond to stressors. And I like how this model whittles it down to kind of three key things. You begin to expect rejection. You begin to engage in cultural or racialized concealment. And I'm going to break all these down. And then you may also end up having, remember, this is a model specifically that targeted sexual identity. So I'm adapting it now to what I would call internalized BIPOC phobia. And then the good news is, to the right of the model here, is that there are ways that we can support ourselves and mitigate the mess of all that takes place kind of in this middle part. There are individual and community level things that we can do that I'll discuss briefly. And then that will determine whether we end up having negative health outcomes, whether physical or mental health negative outcomes, or whether we can mitigate those and move towards more resilient factors that are more positive. And then the characteristics, prominence, how common it is, and then how well we're able to integrate it in. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So the theory, essentially, MST, you're learning a new psychological theory today. You know, I know this is part of this platform that we can learn new things and really expand the horizons of our knowledge. And this is a very prominent psychological theory that comes up a lot across psychological journals and psychological conversations. Now, theories are important because theories shape public policy, they shape provincial reforms, they shape budgets, they also shape how clinicians are trained at graduate programs. And this is why it's important to have persons that are racialized who are doing the research. Oftentimes we focus a lot on being practitioners and first-line workers, which is completely understandable, but a lot of what shapes and informs what I do are the kinds of policies that are shaped by theory. So I'm learning that. It takes special discipline to get involved in research and to sit down and to discipline yourself and to write chapters and to write articles, all of things that are part of my responsibility. Just to give some background, out of 100 graduates in the United States who obtain a clinical psychology degree, only 1 out of 100 are Black males. Now, there's certainly others who are racialized minorities, but in my particular position, I have a strong responsibility to the African diaspora and also to racialized groups at large, and really being able to speak to theories and expanding theories. So the focus has been largely on sexual minorities, but helping expand this theory to apply to racialized communities is also important. So MST, essentially summarized very simply, is groups that are subject to unique stressors because of their racialized position that have negative effects on mental health and physical health. And these kind of stressors can be either proximal, meaning right around you, right in your community. And I'm going to talk about how we can begin to look at community soon. Microaggressions, maybe cues that might take place around you. So certain cues might be overtly, you don't get invited to certain social outings. And then perhaps more subtle ways might be essentially perhaps not being included on certain projects. Other ways of expression are sometimes well-intentioned means of trying to engage with you, but oftentimes the interaction is actually more offensive than helpful. For example, there's stories or accounts of persons in public settings asking persons again, how do you do your hair in that fashion? And kind of going into it more and more, and sometimes making the person uncomfortable without necessarily realizing. So the intent can be at times aggressive and misinformed, but also it can also be intentional. The effects of it are primarily 3. Now, I'm sure we can come up with a long, exhaustive list, but I like how this theory kind of focuses on 3. So you have proximal and distal stressors, then you have 3 primary effects. The first one is what I call internalized BIPOC phobia. And then that's essentially because of your exposure to these negative attitudes and societal perceptions around your particular racialized position or racialized group, then you, without knowing perhaps, have begun to internalize some of those values, which results in a little bit of a degree of self-hate, and can result oftentimes in also a sense of lowered self-esteem. So internalized BIPOC phobia. A lot of us would say, who, me? I would never dare engage with that. But sometimes if we're not analyzing our beliefs, if we don't have either therapeutic relationships or go to therapy or have persons that really can help us analyze underlying motives for what we do, then this is something that potentially can occur in environments where we are experiencing minority stress. The next one is perceived stigma, where you begin to be on high alert. This can often mimic what we call racial trauma, where you're hypervigilant and you anticipate rejection. In many ways, you're kind of on the defensive. And when you're on the defensive in a workplace, you don't feel really connected to the workplace. You feel disengaged from the workplace environment. You really feel othered and isolated as a result of that. So this perceived stigma, and it may be true, or it may be sometimes overinflated because of past experiences or a high vulnerability that has been developed due to it. And then third one is concealment. So you may become very fixated on what might be some of the negative stigmas that have been mentioned around you from number 2. And then concealment takes place where you begin to maybe mask some of your expressions. You may wear different clothing. You may not want to mention certain cultural traditions that are taking place and transpiring. You may want to maybe blindly acquiesce to whatever is the dominant culture. And, this can have dual effect. For some people, this does not affect them because for some persons, they don't necessarily go through something or experience what we call racial centrality. Racial centrality is if race is an identity of yours that is central to who you are. For many persons, it is not. So concealment is not as damaging for them per se as it might be for someone who race and their racial expressions is very central, and now they have to come into an environment where it must now be concealed, or at least they perceive that it needs to be concealed for them to thrive and for them to have success or to be accepted. And the third section here is what we call in the theory minority coping. And there's good news, there's minority coping where through coping strategies, we can mitigate the effects of minority stress. So I'm just going to go back to the model again, just to refresh your memory. So again, we're talking about racialized groups, general stressors or minority stressors take place specifically. We engage in expectations of rejection, concealment. We internalize some of those negative racial views. And then now we're at the point of coping and social supports that can mitigate whether we will have negative or experience more positive or resilient outcomes. And some of these will not necessarily be mind-blowing or a surprise to some of you. And a lot of things when it comes to psychological research and psychological resilience, a lot of times it's things that make a lot of sense, things that we would not be surprised that could be helpful in mitigating the effects. The challenge is creating and finding environments where we can actually practice them and stick with them. It takes a long time for the brain, for the psyche to get adjusted to new habits and to new routines and to new experience to begin to mitigate the effect of negative stress. So social support, so a general sense of connectedness to racialized community. And that's what you're doing here today. So shout out to Culture Check. Whether you knew it or not, you were living right down the stream of what the MST model recommends, which is to find connection with those individuals. When I was a therapist in California, I would encounter clients who were obtaining opportunities in managerial roles in California. And what we were finding during that time is that a lot of those opportunities were not were given to non-Hispanic, non-white persons in California. So a big part of dealing with that sense of kind of isolation as a manager, not really seeing other people that look like you in those positions, was finding organizations and clubs within California or even virtually across the nation to help mitigate that sense of loneliness and isolation. Reframing is another suggestion from the MST framework, and it's simply reappraising, and that reappraisal might mean devaluing some of the stigmatized values of the dominant culture. Okay, so there's two things: reappraising what might have been stigmatized on you, and it might also be devaluating what might be some heralded beliefs from the macro society. Racial socialization is the third one here, and perhaps one of the most important. Racial socialization is kind of like a preemptive thing where you examine practices that promote cultural awareness. And it's also a way of preparing you in advance for anticipated discrimination. So what things to look out for, what things to kind of be privy to so that it doesn't blindside you. A lot of these things oftentimes are experiences also of cultural pride and traditions, racial pride, socialization messages around pride around being Black or brown or other racialized groups. So a lot of this is highly influenced by your family of origin or your household. Many of us came from households where they wanted to be model minorities. And sometimes, as you're a model minority in Canada, sometimes that means blindly acquiescing to a dominant culture without clear conversations about what makes your particular racialized group unique. So I grew up as a Haitian Canadian, and amazing family, amazing parents. We didn't have a lot of questions or conversations rather around racial socialization. So growing up in the 90s, where Haiti during that time under the Clinton regime or the Clinton administration was going through a lot of instability, there wasn't a lot of conversations around the teasing that I was getting in the school. There wasn't a lot of conversations around Haiti being the first Black republic of the Western Hemisphere, and a lot of historical figures and historical movements that have come out of Haiti, because it was really portrayed in a very negative light during that time. So I could have done a lot better if I had been exposed to racial socialization. I'm not blaming my parents. I'm not blaming my environment. I can do better now with my son to ensure that when he goes into certain environments, there's a sense of pride in his racial heritage, and you along with those that you love and those around you. And then I'm just going to simply overview. This is called the Bronfenbrenner model. It helps you look at your now, what does minority stress look like in your life in general? And this is just a wonderful way of looking at it. We can look at our lives in different segments. So the micro system here is those that are most direct that you engage with. That might be a church group, that might be your workplace, that can be your neighborhood. And then with that, you have your own unique personality type. You might be naturally more introverted, naturally more extroverted. These are unique characteristics all within your microsystem. The mesosystem is the next one. So you're right here in the middle. What is most direct around you is your family, your friends, your school, your peers, your workplace. The mesosystem is all of the aggregate conversations or interactions between people in the microsystem. And this impacts you. You can overhear a conversation that might not be directly about you, but you might hear it by the water dispenser, your boss, and a colleague having a very racially inappropriate conversation. They may treat you with wonderful respect when they see you, but you have now become privy to what their conversations may be like when they're no longer in your presence. And suddenly this environment has now become unsafe and uncomfortable for you. That's the mesosystem. Mesosystem is all of the interactions that potentially could take place. That could be a teacher. There's a lot of studies that came out in the 1980s and 1990s that were not discussed, how a lot of racialized students were not being given certain academic opportunities here in Ontario. These are conversations that I don't seldom remember hearing on CTV or CBC growing up. So this might have been when our parents went to the parent-teacher interview as racialized parents to a racialized child growing up in our school system. There might have been comments or opportunities for growth like science fairs or summer development that teacher might not have mentioned to your parents in that room. And then once another parent came into the room, they then mentioned and shared those brochures. So this is all taking place within the exchanges within the mesosystem. The exosystem is further out, meaning it's other influences. It could be other neighborhoods. It could be friends of family, mass media. So that's a larger perspective. And then the macro system is the ideologies of our culture. So ideologies that might be shaped after the Me Too movement, after the George Floyd murder, after Y2K, views around Islamophobia that occurred during that time. So there's a lot of different ideologies that shape the way that we think. So we're a lot broader than just our individual. All these layers influence us. And then the chronosystem. Chronosystem is where we are now in time. So for example, in the early 90s, there were conversations, you would probably tune into CNN, and there were conversations around around admitting racialized groups to post-secondary school affirmative action that were probably very affirming and very positive. And now 20 plus years later, 30 years later, these same conversations are now of a different tone. So that really impacts and influences how these persons are viewed. So microsystem, again, is those most central and direct influencing you. Mesosystem is the interaction between them. Exosystem are broader systems like your workplace code of ethics, the Canadian Human Rights Act. The macro system is ideologies of culture. It's been shifted by the COVID culture. There's a famous book that came out called The Mass Exodus. A lot of persons who have now gone a taste of the virtual world are now resisting kind of traditional 9-to-5 placements. That's a new macro system that might not have emerged as quickly, even in this technological age, if it was not forced upon our culture because of COVID shifts in workplace values. And then the chrono system, where we live. Things were very different after 9/11. Things were very different after Y2K. Things were very different after post-pandemic, and these things impact us. So how does it apply at work? Now, this is a model that was used in Australia in the workplace, and I'm adapting it now to how minority stress may show up in your particular world, in your particular workplace context. So you're the individual employee, and then the next level would essentially be this microsystem of those that are most impactful around you. So friends at work, colleagues at work, so they may not be friends, but they're colleagues. Just the general community of your workplace, where it's located. Is it in a residential area? Is it in a more conservative or liberal community? The mesosystem are the conversations taking place between them. Exosystem, as I mentioned, could be the Canadian Bill of Rights. We're learning on the state side that some long heralded protections can be repealed at any time, regardless of your political views around abortion or affirmative action. What we're learning is that there are certain things that we are always taught that are just solid. Once it's legislator, but we're learning that things can certainly be based on certain conversations, can in fact be repealed and change the tone completely. What are your union's views around discrimination? Are your union leaders and heads privy to these things and sensitive to them? So why minority stress theory is important in the context of your workplace? Hear me out. Because when you are subject to stress in the workplace, you may minimize which layer is most responsible for the impact of that stress. So you may displace it, or you may place it in the right place. However, what is key is to always have a broad view of how this has been impacting you and how it's impacting your workplace. And there are sometimes, not to absolve frontline managers, frontline supervisors, but there could be also other broader systemic factors going on influencing your experience of stress in the workplace. And those could be distal, further out in the layers, and they could be proximal, meaning right, direct interactions, which can sometimes be more hurtful and more distressing psychologically. So a good example, for example, is this helps you differentiate between general stressors and minority stressors. Sometimes they can be conflated and it can be hard to tell. For example, general stressors are stressors that impact generally all of society. Some, due to privilege or elevated SES, may be able to mitigate or buffer the effects, but in general, society was impacted by COVID-19. There are organizations that experience mass layoffs, in general impacting the entire employee base. So that's different than minority stressors, for example, where you are laid off not because of a global pandemic and for obvious budgetary reasons, but based on prejudice and discrimination. It's sometimes hard to be able to differentiate the two, but the purpose of this presentation is to help kind of broaden your view and to broaden your thinking patterns. And that's why oftentimes it's good to have this conversation with a multicultural, competent therapist, or also have these conversations with trusted confidants or trusted persons in your circle, so that you have a good understanding of what might be the source of these stressors, so that you target the right interventions accordingly. And that concludes my presentation. I just want to show you one more time the model, and then I'm sure now we're going to transition to some questions that you may have or conversations around this model.